So that leads to the question of whether or not the higher cost of education is all worth it. We managed to speak to one delegate who happens to be from the University of California at Berkeley, and this is what he had to say.
It also happens that the unemployment rate for those without an upper secondary education, this is the number, increased by 4% in the OECD, that means the richer countries, during the crisis. It rose by only 1.5% by the highly educated. And the problem is that this happens year in, year out. And then the difference just keeps widening and widening and widening all the time. But again, it speaks in favor of going for it.
In terms of the cost of education in the United States, it's important not to talk or use a broad brush. We have to look at different sectors, the public sector, the private sector. Clearly, tuition has gone up in public universities largely as a result of governmental disinvestment in higher education. And I think that's one of the other challenges our chancellor from UC Berkeley is going to be discussing here, is how do we bring back public support for higher education, which is both a public and a private good.
And that's the real dilemma for a lot of families with kids, and maybe even more than one child, is the cost of education. And a lot of people are saying, is it all worth it? Tracy's back with us. You're looking at and trying to answer that hard question.
It is a hard question. How can you even answer that? How can you put a price on education, Phil? You know, I spoke to a lot of people, university professors and students in New York not too long ago to talk about this burgeoning cost of education. And they say that it is, in fact, crippling not only students, but parents across the United States. We've all heard of the staggering numbers. At $1.2 trillion and counting, student debt is the second highest form of debt after mortgages. But unlike a mortgage where many borrowers can refinance or face foreclosures, student debt does not go away and often cannot be refinanced. According to finaid.org, Americans owe more on their student loans than they do on their credit cards. The organization says student loan debt is growing at a rate of almost $3,000 per second, and there's no sign of that pace slowing down.
Well, it is a crisis because if you can't finance your college education, then it becomes inaccessible to large numbers of students. And what we've seen is that increasingly middle-class students are finding it more and more difficult to afford college. And financial aid and scholarships haven't kept up. And the debt that students have to take on to afford a college education has increased considerably, so as well as the interest rates.
Today, 2/3 of students graduating from American colleges are burdened with some form of debt. The Institute for College Access and Success says the average student will graduate with a $27,000 hole in their pocket. But if you think the greatest debt burden falls on the poorest students, think again.
The vast majority of poor kids are not going to college at all. So they're just not even in the picture. And for them, it's not simply the cost, it's also the question of academic preparation. So there are other issues involved there. I think for the middle class, as you pointed out, the real issue is the cost and the affordability and the fact that there simply aren't the kind of supports. What we've seen over the last few years is that all colleges have increased tuition, but public universities, which was, I think, the real point of access for the middle class, have considerably raised their rates.
With so much emphasis being placed on higher education, the rising college costs and underemployment of college graduates is making student debt a crippling problem. Experts say colleges need to lower their tuitions and the government needs to do more to configure student debt.
So the federal government can do a lot by trying to configure how best to support students through the various programs that the government has. They are constantly now trying to use the bully pulpit of the presidency and some congressional committees to talk about how higher education is becoming too expensive for many people. And they're trying to put pressure on colleges and universities to restrain their increases in tuition.